Michael, come to the door.
No, you don't have a warrant. You need to leave.
I don't need a warrant to talk to you.
The consensual contact is declined.
This is not a consensual contact. This is an investigative detention. Come to the door.
The sun was hot in Coolidge, Arizona, but the argument over the property line was even hotter. Julian Vane stood on his side of the low wall, watching a contractor work on the house next door. To Julian, it looked like the new construction was moving onto his land. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't going to let someone take his property. Julian called out over the wall to the contractor. He pointed out where he believed his land ended and the neighbors began. The contractor didn't like being told what to do. Soon, the two men were going back and forth. Voices were raised, and the air got thick with tension. Julian stayed firm, but he never crossed the wall and never touched the other man. There were no threats and no physical pushing. It was just a heated talk between two people who didn't agree. Julian thought the conversation was over when he walked back toward his house. He figured they would deal with the property line later. He had no idea that the contractor was already reaching for his phone. On the other side of the wall, the contractor felt insulted. Instead of calling a surveyor or the homeowner he worked for, he decided to call the police. He told the 911 operator that there was a disturbance and that a neighbor was yelling at him. What started as a simple disagreement about a fence line was about to turn into a full-scale battle for Julian's rights. When officers Riker and Shaw arrived at the scene, they didn't go to Julian's house first. Instead, they found the contractor, who was still feeling very upset. The contractor told the officers that Julian had been aggressive and was flaring up at him. He even claimed that Julian had trespassed onto the construction property, though he later admitted the wall had kept them apart the whole time. The officers didn't seem to care that Julian had stayed on his own land. They listened to the contractor's story and started asking leading questions, almost like they were trying to help him make Julian look guilty. They didn't look for the other side of the story. Instead, they quickly decided that Julian was the primary aggressor in the argument. The contractor even complained to the police that Julian's family was calling his boss to tell a different version of what happened. This only made the officers more focused on Julian. It was clear that the contractor's hurt feelings were enough to make the police view Julian as a criminal before they even knocked on his door. As the officers walked away from the contractor, it became clear that they weren't just doing their jobs, they were making things personal. Officer Riker and Officer Shaw started talking about Julian, and they realized they already knew exactly who he was. They mentioned that they had a 21 on him, which was their way of saying they had his information on file. One of the officers admitted that he had received rude emails from Julian in the past. Because Julian had been difficult to deal with before, the officers didn't go to his door with an open mind. They didn't want to hear his side of the property line argument, they wanted to show him who was in charge. The officers marched toward Julian's front door with a plan to force him to talk. Even though they saw cameras everywhere, they didn't slow down. Officer Riker even joked that Julian was wrong and probably wouldn't answer because he was hiding. They weren't looking for a fair conversation anymore. They were going to his house to start a confrontation because they simply didn't like him. As soon as they reached the front porch, Officer Riker began to bang on the door with his fist. It wasn't a normal knock, it was a loud, heavy pounding that echoed through the house. At the same time, the officers started pushing the doorbell over and over again. They wanted to make sure Julian knew they weren't going away until he came outside. Inside the house, Julian watched them on his security cameras. He knew his rights and knew he didn't have to open the door for a conversation he didn't want to have. He stayed quiet, hoping they would eventually leave his property. But the officers were getting more frustrated by the second. The contractor yelled over from the next yard, complaining that Julian's family was calling his boss. This seemed to make the officers even more determined. Officer Riker shouted at the house, demanding that Julian come to the door. He even told Julian that he was being detained, even though Julian was safely inside his own home. The peace of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the constant, aggressive sound of the police trying to force their way into a private conversation. Inside the house, Julian knew he had to do something to stop the noise. Every time the doorbell rang, it felt like a hammer hitting his brain. He decided to turn the doorbell off completely. For a second, there was silence, and he hoped the officers would finally take the hint and leave his property. But Officer Riker noticed the change immediately. Instead of leaving, he became even more annoyed. "You hear that? You turned the doorbell off," Riker shouted toward the door. He didn't care that Julian was clearly asking for peace. "We're not going anywhere, Julian. Come to the door." Riker then started pounding on the wood even harder than before, using his fist to make up for the silent doorbell. The situation was getting out of control. The officers were acting like they owned the porch, refusing to respect Julian's right to be left alone in his own home. Julian realized that the people who were supposed to protect the law were the ones breaking it by staying where they weren't wanted. Feeling trapped and harassed, Julian picked up his phone. He didn't call a lawyer or a friend. He dialed 911 to report that the police officers on his front porch were trespassing and refused to go away. Julian sat on his sofa, listening to the heavy boots pacing back and forth on his porch. He felt like a prisoner in his own home. He knew that if he walked out that door, the officers would grab him, even though he hadn't committed a crime. He decided to take a bold step and dialed 911. "I need to report a trespass," Julian told the operator. He explained that there were 2 men on his property who refused to leave after being told to go. The operator was confused at first because the men Julian was describing were her own officers. She sent a message to Officer Riker's radio, telling him that the homeowner wanted them to leave immediately. Riker didn't even flinch when he heard the message. Instead of walking away, he leaned toward the door with a smirk. "I received your message, Julian," he shouted through the wood. He told the dispatcher to let Julian know that he wasn't going anywhere. "I will sit out here all night until he comes and speaks with me," Riker declared. It was a strange and scary standoff. The police were being told by their own dispatch office that they were trespassing, but they simply chose to ignore it. Julian realized then that these officers didn't care about the rules, they only cared about winning. Julian stood by the window, watching the 2 officers. He knew they were breaking the rules. In the United States, a person's home is a special place that the police cannot just enter whenever they want. This protection is part of the Fourth Amendment. Julian knew about a famous case called Payton versus New York. That case says that unless there is a real emergency, police need a warrant to come inside a house. The officers outside were claiming they could stay there because of an investigative detention. But Julian knew better. He knew that the front porch is what the law calls curtilage. Curtilage is the area right around a home, like a porch or a yard, and it is protected just like the inside of the house. Another big case, Collins versus Virginia, says the police can't just hang out in your curtilage without a warrant. Officer Riker was acting like a visitor, but visitors have to leave when you tell them to. If a Girl Scout or a neighbor comes to your door, they have an implied license to be there. But as soon as the homeowner says go away, that license is gone. Julian had already told the officers to leave, and he even called 911 to make it official. By staying on the porch and banging on the door, the cops were no longer just talking, they were trespassing on Julian's constitutional rights. Officer Riker and Officer Shaw were not going to give up. They were tired of Julian ignoring them, so they decided to use a common police tactic to get what they wanted. While Riker continued to bang on the door, Shaw moved closer to the edges of the doorframe. He was acting like he was looking for a secret way inside. Suddenly, Julian opened his heavy interior door just a crack to tell them one last time to leave his property. As soon as the air from inside the house hit the porch, Officer Shaw made a big claim. "Oh man, the pot as soon as you open the door," he said. By saying he smelled marijuana, Shaw was trying to create probable cause. This is a legal reason that sometimes allows police to enter a home without a warrant. Julian didn't fall for it. He knew that in many places, police try to use the smell of drugs as an excuse to break the rules of the Fourth Amendment. He told the officers that even if they thought they smelled something, they still needed a warrant to cross his threshold. The officers were getting desperate. They told Julian that no judge would likely sign a warrant for such a small issue, but they still refused to leave his porch. They were trapped in a lie, they weren't allowed to go in, but they were too stubborn to go away. As the minutes ticked by, Julian remembered something important. He wasn't just a citizen with rights, he was a homeowner who knew the department's own playbook. The police have general orders, which are the rules they must follow while on duty. Julian decided to use these rules to make the officers uncomfortable. He noticed that the officers were no longer just standing on the concrete of his porch. They had stepped off the path and were now standing on the decorative rocks in his front yard. Julian saw his chance. He opened the interior door again, staying behind the security screen. "Stop walking on the rocks," he shouted. "It is a violation of general orders. Only walk on the common ground." The officers looked down at their boots, surprised that Julian knew about their specific training rules. Julian didn't stop there. He told them clearly that they were trespassing on his landscaping and that their presence was illegal. "Get off my rocks," he demanded, over and over. He was using every tool he had to show them that he was in control of his property. By pointing out their violation of the department's own rules, Julian was making it harder for them to stay. He had already called 911 on them, and now he was documenting every small mistake they made. The officers, who had arrived thinking they could bully Julian into coming outside, were now the ones being told what to do. Even though they were still acting tough, they were finally starting to move back toward the street. The tension on the porch finally started to break. Officers Riker and Shaw realized that Julian wasn't going to be scared into coming outside. Their plan to use loud noise and aggressive demands hadn't worked. Julian had stayed calm, stayed inside, and used the law to protect himself. Officer Riker stopped his heavy pounding on the door. He looked frustrated because his investigative detention had turned into a long wait in the Arizona heat. He knew that without a warrant, he couldn't step across that doorway. Even though he had told Julian he would sit there all night, it was becoming clear that the officers were just wasting their time. The officers took one last look at the cameras surrounding the house. They knew that everything they had done, the pounding, the refusal to leave, and the threats, was all recorded. The power was shifting. Julian was no longer just a neighbor who yelled, he was a man who had successfully stood up to the police on his own property. The officers began to step back toward the street, realizing that their attempt to bully Julian had completely failed. Julian watched through his camera as the officers finally stepped back from the porch. They were no longer pounding on the door, but they were still lingering on his property. They stood right on top of his decorative landscaping rocks, acting like they still had a reason to be there. Julian wasn't going to let them have the last word. He opened his interior door one more time to make sure they heard him clearly. "Get off my rocks," he shouted again. He reminded them that by standing there, they were violating their own department's general orders. The officers looked annoyed, but they finally began to shuffle toward the sidewalk. They were trespassed from the property, and Julian had made it very clear that they were no longer welcome anywhere on his land. As they reached the edge of his yard, they turned around to face the house one last time. They looked small standing out by the street after trying so hard to act big on his porch. Julian stayed behind his door, watching them through the screen. He had successfully defended his home without ever stepping outside or giving in to their demands. The siege of the front porch was almost over, but the officers had one final thing to say before they disappeared. The standoff was finally reaching its end. Officers Riker and Shaw stood by the street, looking back at Julian's house one last time. They knew they had lost this battle. They hadn't forced Julian out, they hadn't gotten inside, and they had been caught on camera the whole time. But as they prepared to leave, Officer Riker couldn't help but take one more shot. "Just for your information, I'm going to be forwarding disorderly conduct charges against you," Riker shouted toward the house. It was a hollow threat, meant to make it feel like the police were still in charge. He told Julian to expect a court date in his mailbox, even though deep down, the officers knew there was no real crime to charge him with. It was just a final attempt to scare a man who refused to be bullied. With those last words, the officers turned and walked to their patrol cars. They drove away from the neighborhood, leaving Julian in peace at last. No charges were ever actually filed, and no court date ever arrived. By standing his ground and knowing his rights, Julian had won. He proved that even when the police refuse to leave, the law says they must, and the truth is always more powerful than a badge.